This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The shoes we wear, the fruit we eat, the electronics we use, a lot of that stuff finds its way to us every week from countries like China, Canada, and Mexico. So, what happens when trade with those countries gets interrupted? Well, we may find out soon. President Donald Trump has imposed a 10% tariff on imported goods from China. He has paused his promise to impose tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico, at least for now. This hour, we'll explore what tariffs actually are, why Trump is pursuing them, and how they may impact businesses and consumers in Connecticut. Joining me now is Lisa Hagen, who's our federal policy reporter for Connecticut Public and Connecticut Mirror. Lisa, thanks so much for joining Where We Live.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And also with us is Dr. Muhammad Elahi, who's the professor of international business at Quinnipiac University. Muhammad, great to have you with us as well.
Thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions about tariffs. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Muhammad, I want to start the conversation with you and also with the basics. Can you tell us, how do tariffs differ from other types of taxes?
Sure. So tariff is basically a type of tax, but it is imposed on imported goods when those goods enter the border. It is very similar in concept like income tax or sales tax, but instead of paying the tax on income or the sales tax, we pay it. Actually, the importers pay it when they get the goods from another country, and then eventually they pass it on to the consumers.
And this is not the first time we're seeing tariffs, right?
No, throughout our history, different administrations, they have tried to impose tariff, sometimes with maybe some economic motives, but most of the time, I would say with political motives. But tariff has been part of our history, and not just part of our history, I would say governments all over the world, they try with different types of tariffs time and again, even though they don't work in most of the cases.
And we'll definitely get into more details about that throughout the conversation. And you mentioned motives because President Trump has listed 4 major reasons for imposing tariffs on Canada, China, and Mexico. He said that they would boost American manufacturing and protect jobs, raise tax revenue, and grow the economy. Is he correct in thinking that tariffs will accomplish all of those goals?
I think these tariffs will lead just to the opposite results. These tariffs will not create any new jobs. This tariff will actually cause pain for businesses and individual consumers. And in the long run, it will even have detrimental effect on U.S. economic growth.
And are there any...
And no matter... And sorry.
Oh, no, go for it.
No, and I think one of the stated reasons is to bring back manufacturing jobs. Not a single job, I think, will come back.
And can you tell us why that is?
So there are reasons why jobs leave a country. Certain jobs where we're still competitive, those jobs will stay in the US. But there are certain industries which are labor intensive. We are not competitive because US is a capital intensive country. Our labor is too expensive. So it makes sense to focus on industries where we have competitive advantage and buy from others where we are not competitive. And especially when it comes to Canada and Mexico, our economies are very integrated. So a lot of imports that we have from Canada and Mexico, they are not necessarily the finished goods. They're industrial goods, inputs that are used in making other goods. So when we impose tariff on those industrial goods, then our production cost of what we make in the USA will go up. And then consumers will pay a higher price, or we will simply fail to export those goods to other countries because our goods will be more expensive than other countries. So I don't think that these tariffs will help bring back jobs in the US. On the other hand, we will all suffer.
Well, with that in mind, too, are there any benefits to tariffs like the ones being proposed?
Frankly speaking, I don't see any benefit. If we had products that we were making in the USA, uh, then maybe if we impose tariff, the domestic industry would survive. Sometime it makes sense to give protection to infant industries. But most of the things that we are buying, they are not being produced in the US.
Right.
If we impose tariff on these three countries, and if there is high demand, we will end up buying those products from other countries and will end up paying higher price. And just for the sake of argument, let's assume that the tariffs are successful in bringing back some jobs in the US. Those jobs will be those. Producing those items will be much more expensive because of our high labor cost. Plus, when we try to produce something, we need supporting and related industries. A lot of those industries have left the US. I'll just give you one example. During the first term of President Trump, when he imposed tariffs, at that time, Dell Computer tried to bring back some jobs. They tried to produce some computers in the US. But the challenge was in the laptop, those small screws that are used, they are not produced anywhere in the USA. So
Right.
where do we get those from? We do not have the total ecosystem just in the USA. But if we look at Canada, Mexico, USA, we have an integrated economy. There is an efficient supply chain. If we try to disrupt this supply chain, that could lead to a lot of inefficiencies, dislocations, and in the long run, everybody will be a loser. There is no winner in this game.
Well, and there's so many things involved with something like this, with decision making processes like these. So, can you talk about why do countries ultimately turn to tariffs?
I don't think all countries turn to tariff. Actually, if you look at what has been happening in the world since the end of the Second World War, countries have been trying to lower tariff, especially the capitalist countries led by the USA. For socialist camp, for the countries that were under the influence of Soviet Union, that was a different story. And their economic model failed. Our economic model survived, prospered, and now, unfortunately, we are trying to dismantle what we have built over years, actually, not just over years, over decades after the Second World War. Many countries, under the leadership of the US, started discussion under the umbrella of GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, to lower tariffs. After 50 years of long discussion, finally all the countries reached an agreement, and that is when in 1995, the World Trade Organization was established. And now we are actually just going back against what we stood for decades. And this type of tariff or unilaterally imposing tariff would also lead to tit for tat action by others. Our trade partners, they might retaliate against us. So that will not be good for anybody. Now, from another point of view, let's say if we forget about the economics, sometimes politics trump economics. So sometimes for political reasons, for our geopolitical objectives, maybe governments can resort to imposing tariff. For example, USA is worried about the rise of China. Many people view China as a threat. And I can understand why the US government wants to impose tariff on Chinese goods, even though I don't agree, but at least I understand. But for Canada and Mexico, it simply doesn't make any sense. Most of the trade that we have with Canada and Mexico, they are actually intra-firm transfer for big US firms, within firm transfers. So many of these trade deficits that we have, they're not with Canada. They are internal transactions for US firms. They have been able to stay competitive. They have been able to stay afloat because they were able to move some of the labor intensive work to other countries. Moreover, there are also some other things that we import from Canada or Mexico. Maybe they have certain minerals. Uh, for example, Canada has a lot of lumbers. So we also buy lumbers. We buy paper pulp. We buy electricity. Quebec has hydroelectricity, surplus hydroelectricity. So it makes sense to buy those things, and we would export where we have competitive advantage. For example, if we look at Connecticut, we have a strong engineering and manufacturing base, although it's not as strong as it used to be 30 years ago, but still we have a decent industrial base. So we have competitive advantage in making machineries that we can export to Canada, and then we can buy raw materials from Canada. So it is win-win for everyone. And if we impose tariff, whether it is Canada or China or Mexico, what happens? Data don't lie. If we look at what happened between 2016 and 19, did our trade deficit decrease? No, it did not shrink. In fact, it increased. Yes, our trade with China was flat, more or less from 2017 and 19. But we were still buying the same Chinese goods, but instead of buying them from China, we were buying them from Vietnam, from Malaysia. Many Chinese manufacturers basically shifted their production offshore. They went to other countries. So we were still buying the same goods to a significant extent, but from another country. So our overall trade deficit still kept on rising. It did not go down. And if I can add another point, while trade deficit, especially this type of rising trade deficit every year should be a concern for any country in the world, but not for the USA. US is in a unique situation, and I can explain that later, that why trade deficit should not be as troublesome for the US as it should be for other countries.
Well, and Lisa, with what Muhammad just built for us, that we do get a lot of both products and materials coming in through Canada, China, and Mexico. President Trump also agreed earlier to pause the anticipated tariffs on Canada and Mexico specifically for a month. Where are we in that month-long pause now, and what do we know about the negotiations taking place?
Yeah, so a lot of it is on pause right now, the 25% kind of across the board ones for Canada and Mexico. And so I think there's at least a few more weeks and trying to wait and see what happened with that. But I mean, as we're speaking, President Trump is supposed to announce new tariffs on steel and aluminum, and I think it should hit those countries, even though again, there's a pause on 25%, again, kind of these like blanket tariffs. And so yeah, I think everyone's kind of in a holding pattern, waiting to see. I mean, again, he's about to announce these tariffs. Completely possible he, renegotiates with some of these countries to maybe, put another pause on that. But these are things he did in his first term, and Muhammad spoke a bit about that. In 2018, he imposed some steel and aluminum tariffs. A lot of them did get walked back in terms of, especially with allies. So, I think as we're waiting to see this, impending announcement on these new tariffs, I'm curious to see how Connecticut is responding, especially in a manufacturing sector with shipbuilding. I know that's been of utmost importance for Connecticut as they weigh these tariffs.
Well, and then there are so many connecting points here and so many areas that we could be impacted that maybe we are not thinking about on a daily basis, but with sort of the slew of decisions coming in through the last couple of weeks, and including the United States Postal Office also recently reversed its decision to halt parcel service from China, and that initial halt was imposed in part due to President Trump's actions on tariffs. What does that mean for businesses and organizations across the country right now? Is there some confusion there, Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, that was specifically in terms of the de minimis exemption. So basically, parcels that come in under $800, they don't basically get tariffs levied on them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as much inspection, and so that clearly sent a ripple effect that has also been delayed, including for China. And so again, I think it's a lot of this holding pattern. Businesses in different industries and sectors waiting to see what's going to happen, but particularly with the one that you're referencing, that would have a huge effect on e-commerce, especially for places like China and on Amazon. And so in terms of that, I think with the de minimis exemption, Trump wanting to make sure that fentanyl isn't coming in through the border,
Mm-hmm.
I think that was his particular aim with that one. But you have lawmakers like Connecticut Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro wanting to get rid of that de minimis loophole. So I mean, there is support for things like that, but I think when you're having big decisions like that, that can really overwhelm markets, and that can really overwhelm, Customs and Border Control, which inspects those packages. You have USPS having to deal with taking in the influx of packages. So, I think we're again in that holding pattern of what's going to
Right.
happen.
Well, and then earlier we also talked about a little bit about what we get from these countries and what's being imported, including building materials, lumber, energy. What other businesses in Connecticut that rely heavily on goods coming from China, Canada, or Mexico?
Yeah, I think energy was the big one. I
Mm.
think a lot of the members were looking specifically to the ones in Canada because we get a lot of not even just Connecticut, but the New England region gets a lot of hydropower from Canada. So I think they were looking to that and getting particularly nervous on that. But yeah, I mean, just across the board. I mean, again, when you have across the board tariffs, you're going to see increases on a litany of things. But I am again particularly curious with these new tariffs that are supposed to come down on steel and aluminum, and even potentially on things like uranium, which you've done before. Again, huge impacts on places like Electric Boat and suppliers that go towards shipbuilding in Connecticut.
And those are certainly things that we will be keeping our eyes and ears on, certainly in the next couple of weeks. And Mohammed, I want to get sort of a twofold question to you before we go to break. What do tariffs mean for inflation? And earlier you mentioned why should trade deficit not be as big of a concern for the U.S. If you can explain that.
Sure. So usually tariffs lead to inflation,
Mm-hmm.
and it happens mainly because of two reasons. When importers have to pay a hefty tariff, they cannot absorb these additional costs. So they actually pass it on to the consumers by raising the price of the products. So consumers end up paying more. And if import becomes prohibitively expensive, maybe those importers will try to source those materials from within the country. Maybe there will be new manufacturing, but again, in the US, labor cost is very high. And because of this high labor, those goods will be more expensive. As a result, consumers will end up paying more. And if we end up paying more for too many items, naturally the general price level will rise. So we will suffer from inflation. And concerning your second question, that why USA should not worry about trade deficit as much as other countries, it's because USA has one unique advantage that no other country has. Dollar is the default global currency. It is not the official global currency. At one point it was, but no longer. But actually, default global currency helps us in many different ways. So when we have a deficit, that means foreigners are lending us money. They have surplus. What will they do with the dollar? They cannot use dollar. So they end up keeping those dollars in US banks. They end up buying US treasury bills. And US dollars, US banks, they are flooded with money. So they can lend to people. We can get mortgage easily. We can get a car loan easily. So people in other countries, they are in a way subsidizing our rich lifestyle in the US. And when dollar goes up in price compared to other currencies, US firms, they can raise money. We have an efficient capital market. They can go and buy firms in other countries. They can go and buy properties in other countries. But when dollar goes down, USA can retire some of the debts. And even with interest, they end up paying less. Just to give an example, in the mid 80s, $1 was worth 300 Japanese yen. So let's say USA borrowed 1 billion yen, and after 10 years, it was going to pay 2 billion yen, even with interest. But by then, $1 was worth only about 90 yen. So even with interest, we ended up paying a lot less. So USA wins when the dollar is high. USA wins when the dollar is low. So again, this is unique about the US. As long as dollar is a global currency, we have certain leverages. And unfortunately, I mean, we are the ones who were at the Unfortunately for others, but fortunately for us, that this system works in our favor.
Well, thank you so much for that. You've been listening to Dr. Mohammed Elahi, who's the professor of international business at Quinnipiac University, and also Lisa Hagen, who's our Connecticut Public and Connecticut Mirror's shared federal policy reporter. They'll both be staying with us. Coming up, how are local lawmakers thinking about the proposed tariffs? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're breaking down what tariffs actually are, why the Trump administration is pursuing them, and how they might impact people like you and me. Still with us is Dr. Mohammed Elahi, who's a professor of international business at Quinnipiac University, and also Lisa Hagen, who's our Connecticut Public and Connecticut Mirror's shared federal policy reporter. And listeners, let us know if you have any questions, 888-720-9677, or let us know about your questions regarding tariffs on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Lisa, I understand that you recently reached out to Congressman Joe Courtney, who's our Connecticut's representative for the 2nd Congressional District. What did he have to say about the potential impact of these tariffs? And have you heard from any other local lawmakers?
I think across the board with the Connecticut delegation, they are not super supportive of the entire approach of Trump's tariffs, especially when it comes to the U.S. trading partners, Mexico and Canada, especially because a lot of them were involved in helping renegotiate NAFTA during the first Trump term and basically have the now U.S., Mexico, Canada trade agreement. And so, even those who have been supportive of using tariffs as a way to, boost manufacturing and boost, domestic markets in the U.S., don't love his approach now. And so for Congressman Courtney, I mean, again, they were particularly trying to track the tariffs that would be implemented on Canada. Again, at least as of today, now on hold, the 25% now might be a different case with steel and aluminum. And I think that's, again, one to watch. But, being particularly cognizant of the ones that could put tariffs on energy production and power that Connecticut gets from Canada. So I know that they were particularly watching that one. And also, again, on a sector that really impacts his district, a lot of the defense contractors, places like Electric Boat, and heard him talk about how places, bigger, I guess, defense contractors like Electric Boat, they have Buy American clauses in their contracts. And so, but that's not to say that places like that are not getting any foreign imports at all. And, especially could have even a bigger impact on smaller suppliers that add to the supply chain on that front. So I think especially frustration when it comes to U.S. trading partners. But, you have people like Rosa DeLauro who she has said that she supports quote, smart use of tariffs. So she has actually been supportive of the ones levied against China. But, in terms of, again, trading partners, not so much.
Well, and really quickly here, Mohammed, historically speaking, who has benefited from tariffs and who has been harmed by them?
Actually, if we look at history, we'll find that most of the time tariffs didn't work. For example, after the 1812 war, the Congress imposed high tariff to protect the US farmers. But then by the middle of the 19th century, it was clear that USA needs to import more from Europe, especially machinery, industrial goods for its own industrialization. So USA lowered the tariff. We also see that in the 1920s, when the economy was booming and then there was a stock market crash in 1929. After that, Congress again acted, and the Smoot-Hawley Act that raised tariff, again, the result was disastrous. It actually exacerbated the situation, and we had the Great Depression. So tariffs don't work. If we go back to the Reagan years, President Reagan imposed tariff on Japanese goods, but the Japanese firms didn't suffer. Their trade surplus kept on going up, and none of the US electronic manufacturers survived actually. President Obama, he imposed tariff on a tire. That didn't really work. And we don't have to go that far. Even if we look at the trade data between 2016 and 19, if we look at the employment data, if we look at the new investment that came to the US, new manufacturing jobs that came to the US, just a close look at the 2016 to 19 data would show that tariff didn't work. From an economic point of view, from a political point of view, that's a different story. And it is possible that President Trump is using this tariff or the threat of tariff as a bargaining tool. That is quite possible. But when we display this type of raw power, when we use coercive tactics like this, it doesn't go well in the long run. It generates ill feelings. It causes hostility in people towards American, in people in other countries toward Americans. And I think this type of threat is neither good from an economic point of view nor good from a diplomatic point of view.
And before we go, Lisa, want to ask, as you're following this very closely, are there types of updates that you'll be watching for in the upcoming days and weeks?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're about to see, new tariffs announced. I think we're supposed to see also today from China retaliatory tariffs. The ones that Canada and Mexico want to do should be on hold because there are negotiations. So yeah, I mean, that again, those can have pretty big ripple effects. And I think like Mohammed said, used as a bargaining tool. And so again, we saw pretty quickly Trump reversing them or putting them on pause. And so, curious to see, what kind of leverage he's trying to use in imposing that or maybe pausing, future tariffs that are about to be announced.
Well, I appreciate you following the story for us, and we'll be definitely checking in with you pretty soon here. You've been listening to Lisa Hagen, who's our federal policy reporter for the Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public. Lisa, always great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
And you're also listening to Dr. Mohammed Elahib, who's the professor of international business at Quinnipiac University. Mohammed, appreciate you taking the time and breaking down what tariffs are for us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And coming up, how are Connecticut businesses and consumers preparing for the potential impacts of tariffs? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're exploring how the Trump administration's new tariffs might impact businesses and consumers here in Connecticut. Joining me now is Wayne Pesch, who's the president of the Connecticut Food Association. Wayne, it's good to see you today.
Morning, Catherine.
And also joining us is Chris Davis, who's the vice president of public policy at CBIA, Connecticut's largest business organization. Chris, appreciate your time as well.
Great to be with you, Catherine. Thanks for having me.
Of course, we have questions for you, but listeners, if you have questions, let us know, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Chris, I want to start with you. Members of the CBIA span many, many industries from all over the state, and this includes startup companies, large corporations, and everything in between. What are business owners telling you right now? Are they worried? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of uncertainty right now in what the impact of these tariffs would be. We've already seen the impact directly, even though the tariffs did not go into place in Canada and Mexico. A lot of our members across industry sectors have had surcharges put on a lot of their contracts just due to that uncertainty in their suppliers and looking to say, be careful about if these tariffs were to take place at any moment, really. So they've built in surcharges now that have had that direct impact. And this is very difficult because a lot of these contracts are hard bid contracts or lump sum contracts. Are very difficult to change after they go into place. So when there's a 10%, 15%, 25% increase in the raw materials or the goods that are coming over, this can have a huge impact on the profitability of these businesses. And more than 4,600 Connecticut companies export goods out of Connecticut internationally each year. And I know Lisa had mentioned electric boat quite a bit in the last segment. However, 89% of these exporters are actually small and medium-sized businesses right in your neighborhood, in your communities. A lot of them are manufacturers, especially in the aerospace sector that does a lot of exporting across the border. So even just the threat of these tariffs have had a direct impact on a number of these businesses so far.
Well, Wayne, earlier we also heard from Muhammad, who teaches international business at Quinnipiac University, build this concern about what could happen, what might happen. We're not quite sure yet. But what are some of your concerns that you and your colleagues at the Connecticut Food Association have regarding the potential tariff impacts on our food industry?
Well, Connecticut already has one of the highest costs of living compared to the national average currently. And obviously, if the tariffs hit in different ways. So, for example, this has been a bit of a shotgun approach in terms of who's going to get a tariff, what that tariff is going to be, and how that might impact food costs. So, for example, in Mexico, we rely on imports for year-round access to fruits and vegetables, um, avocados, tomatoes, peppers, citrus fruits. So yeah, during the summer when our farmers are growing food and everything is working in a way where we can get those products, that's great. But we're here in January, February, March, and fortunately for U.S. consumers, we're able to get those products, and many of them come from Mexico. So some real concern about those particular products. We could see a price spike anywhere between 15 to 20% on those products, potentially. In terms of Canada, again, there's no consistent approach here. The products are a bit different. Lots of beef and pork and cheese coming from Canada. So same thing, right? Paying more for those products if they come down through the border and there's a tariff on them. And then when you think of China, it's very interesting. You get some seafood and other processed foods from there. But the interesting thing about China is they process most of the world's cocoa because they get it from Africa. And then there's been a real issue with cocoa production because of drought in sub-Saharan Africa. And the cost of cocoa, if you think about cocoa for a minute, it's in so many products. And whether that's the chocolate that you get, whether that's your baking needs. So they process cocoa in China and that comes here. So cocoa's already got some issues. Take the fact that it's processed in China, you put a tariff on it to get it here, and then you have a staple product that people are going to be paying a lot more for. So some current concerns about those particular categories.
And can you give us an idea of who does the Connecticut Food Association include?
So we represent most of the traditional grocery retailers that you remember growing up, right? So we are the independent grocer, the IGA, the mom and pops, and the regional players. Big Y, Stop and Shop, Price Chopper, Market 32, ShopRite, Aldi. So we have a combination. We also represent many of the suppliers and distributors of food products as well.
And Chris, as we've been hearing, I think a lot of businesses and consumers are already feeling the pinch of what's been going on. Are there any existing challenges in Connecticut's business industry that could be made worse or better if tariffs are imposed?
Well, as Wayne mentioned, Connecticut is a very high cost state. We have very high energy costs. We have high labor costs compared to other parts of the state. And then when we're competing globally, it makes it even that much more difficult. So anytime that there's a chance that increased costs, especially on the imports of raw materials or the exporting of our products across those borders, it puts that strain on the ability for Connecticut's companies to compete both nationally and globally. So any chance of those increased costs could put Connecticut at a disadvantage. So that's why a lot of our members across all industry sectors are very closely watching this. And we saw some real benefits come from the USMCA coming into place, especially in our manufacturing sector. It allowed products to travel back back and forth across the borders with Canada and Mexico in order to help reduce those costs. So by putting these tariffs on here, you have a real chance that companies are going to put the brakes on onshoring from to products that they previously maybe got from China or other low-cost states. They brought them back over here to America because of these changes. You might see businesses decide to look elsewhere around the globe to try to find those lower costs.
And Wayne, when we're looking at historical averages, grocery prices are already relatively high, and that is certainly on top of mind for many people today. What might tariffs mean for these prices? I know it's kind of hard to do the math right now with so many moving parts, but do we know approximately how much prices will rise?
So if you go back to 2022, food prices have risen almost 25%. And again, that's just an over-the-top number. It's different by category. It's driven by different factors. A lot of it was driven by post-pandemic woes,
Mm-hmm.
but some of it is being driven by um, disruptions in terms of climate disruptions. If you go back, Ukraine was actually the breadbasket of the world at one point. So there are a bunch of factors that have driven this inflation in food costs. And so this just piles right on top of that. And I think, you know, when you look at this through the lens of a consumer, it becomes very, very difficult to understand when, just 2 years ago, I walked into the store and I walked out with, 3 or 4 bags of groceries for $150. And now I'm walking out with less than half of that. Something feels wrong about that. And then I get really concerned about if you look at food insecurity in the state of Connecticut, it is at record levels. And so, okay, some people are going to absorb these costs and move on and not be nobody's happy. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic background is. You are not happy right now with having to go out and buy groceries. Or, by the way, go out and eat at a restaurant because those folks are struggling the same way as the grocery stores. Take any restaurant in the state of Connecticut, and they're struggling as well for the same reason. And if I'm a single mom with 2 kids, and let's say I'm making 75 grand a year, well, it impacts me a lot more when food is up because I have to feed my family than somebody who's just complaining about that cost. So I'm real concerned in terms of what this does to folks who are our most vulnerable residents. And I add this onto an existing problem that we already have.
Well, and you mentioned disruptions earlier, especially in regards to the pandemic. We did see so much there in so many different ways, and people sort of flocking to the markets to basically stockpile whatever they can. Are you seeing, or do you have same concerns about people stockpiling food products now in anticipation of tariff-related price increases?
You know what? I don't see that behavior only because there's just a what if, an unknown, right?
Right.
Is it going to hit Mexico? Many of those products are perishables. So how are you gonna hoard perishables? The other thing we haven't talked about, and the president hasn't been clear on this, is European products. So if you like French wine or olive oil or things like that, get ready. So yeah, no, I don't know that there'll be a lot of hoarding, or certainly won't be panic buying. It would be
Mhm.
hoarding, and so I'm not sure it's going to go in that direction. Um, I think it's more the confusion that consumers will face in terms of the categories that they're trying to purchase. So right now, if you go into a store and bananas, you're used to paying 69 cents a pound for a banana. Most people know
Right.
that price point, right? Now all of a sudden you're paying $1.09 for bananas. Okay, that's real. You feel that, you know that right away. So again, you're not going to hoard those products, but boy, you're
Mhm.
certainly going to feel the effect if you have bananas in your shopping cart every week.
Well, and Chris, we've been talking a lot about short-term impacts to consumers and business owners. What are some of the long-term impacts that business owners could be facing if the proposed tariffs are implemented?
Well, it could be a scenario where those increases in prices get built into long-term contracts at this point, which then could have a lasting impact on the cost of those goods, both importing and exporting out of Connecticut. And a lot of our members have compared this to that uncertainty during COVID, as you mentioned. Things are moving quickly. Do they need to stockpile raw materials, especially heading into these tariff threats? We saw a number of businesses across different industries begin to really ramp up their order of those raw materials to try to offset potential cost increases in the future. So if these were to take effect and these tariffs were to be put onto these products in an indeterminate amount of time, you could start seeing a lot of these longer term contracts building into those costs. And then that impact over a long period of time will be felt by Connecticut consumers as well as our trading partners around the globe.
And Wayne, is that something that you're seeing in the food industry as well, or is that a similar impacts?
No doubt, no doubt. And Chris brings up an interesting point because for any business to thrive, they need certainty. And the uncertainty of this lens is difficult to gauge because you're making decisions based on the known, not the unknown, and this creates a lot of uncertainty.
And that's certainly a familiar space we've been in the last couple of weeks, just because it's a little difficult to get some solid answers. But earlier we heard from Mohammed talking a lot about sort of the negative impacts that tariffs could have. Do either of you see anything positive that could come out from this? Wayne, want to start with you first?
Not necessarily with tariffs.
Okay.
Anything that causes the price of food to rise, whether that is where you shop for your food or when you go out to eat with your family, I think it impacts the quality of life in our state.
Chris, what do you think?
I would say short term, it definitely will cause that pain that we're feeling, both as on the business side, as the employer side of the cost of doing business, but also on the consumer side of the cost of those goods and services. Long term, I think the strategic goals by this administration appear to be an attempt to try to onshore a lot of this, and you could see potential benefits from that, especially for our manufacturers here in Connecticut, where this cost shift from some of these lower cost countries that we've seen over the last few years to onshoring them onto either American-based companies or even within that USMCA trading agreement. There could be some potential long-term benefits in that respect, but
Right.
it really comes down to what those policies are. And as Wayne mentioned, we need that predictability and that certainty in order to make those types of investments here in America, and especially here in Connecticut, given our high costs. So, the long term, there could be benefits, but with that uncertainty, it makes it very difficult to kind of see those at this point.
And Chris, as we look into the future, what do you hope to see happen in the coming days and weeks?
Well, we want to have some of that certainty, right? We need to
Mm-hmm.
know there was a pause here for 30 days. However, we get the announcement this morning that all steel and aluminum could potentially have tariffs, and that could have a huge impact on a lot of our manufacturers here in Connecticut. So really looking to try to get that certainty and idea, if these tariffs are to take place and they are to be long term, we can build those into our costs and try to provide the best product at the best price going forward. But without knowing whether or not a tariff is being put on. And Wayne raised a great point too. We have had little discussion about the impact on Europe. And Germany is our number 2 trading partner, Netherlands number 3, United Kingdom outside of the EU now, but they're number 4. So once those take place, or if they take place, the impact could be even more widespread. So we're really keeping a very close eye on this. It's across industry sectors that we're really being careful about here. But we hope that the positive benefits of that onshoring, increased manufacturing here in Connecticut are something that comes out of this. But we really need that certainty in order to make that happen.
And I think as we continue to follow this, Wayne, what might Connecticut do to cushion the impacts of tariffs on consumers and retailers across the state?
Well, we could look at the tax structure. I think there are things that we can do to make it more affordable to live here in the state. Look, I think we're about to be out of the ARPA phase of how Connecticut was able to fund the things. So, I look at this in a broader context in terms of not just food prices. This is about energy costs. This is about transportation costs. This is about taxes on businesses and your ability to function here and thrive. You want to keep people in the state, then make it competitive. So, yeah, these tariffs are an issue, but we have other issues, and so I think I've seen some glimmers in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, but again, we've been fat, dumb, and happy with ARPA money, so we're about to see what is going to happen here in the state. And one of the things I always say, look, we're brick and mortar retailers. We can't take our stores out of the state. When we lose population here, when we lose our college graduates, or we lose folks that are retired with a pocket full of money and they go elsewhere because they can't afford to live here, we need to be that needs to be priority one. And then everything else will take care of itself in terms of, short-term tariffs and things of that nature.
And Chris, I want to get some final thoughts from you here based on what Wayne just shared. And that's similar theme to a lot of conversations that we've been having is many times we're talking about one thing, but the one thing really interconnects with many other things and everything is connected to each other as a ripple effect. What do you hope our listeners get from this conversation today?
I think the number one thing is affordability, right? And Wayne hit on that. And, we ask all the lawmakers through our reimagined CT policy solutions agenda this year to take a look at every single bill that they see and say, does this make Connecticut more affordable for businesses, more affordable for employers to employ more people with 75,000 job openings here in Connecticut, as well as more affordable for those consumers and residents within our state to purchase those goods and services from our employers. So we ask that everyone at state capitol, every decision that they're making should be based around, does this make Connecticut more affordable, an easier place to employ people, and a better place for us to raise our kids and have our families. So, with that, I think your listeners just keep in mind, we're striving every day here at the Connecticut Business and Industry Association to try to make Connecticut more affordable for our residents and our employers.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughts. As we mentioned earlier, this is something that we'll be keeping our eye on, and this will certainly not be the first conversation about the issue. You've been listening to Chris Davis, who's the Vice President of Public Policy at the CBIA. Thank you so much, Chris, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
You are also listening to Wayne Pesch, who's the President of the Connecticut Food Association. Wayne, it was great having you as well.
Thank you, Catherine.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.